This is Ross Feingold on the Taiwan Hashtag program, hosted on Storm Media. Today, once again, we are coming from Hong Kong. No, we are not in Taipei. We are on the road in Hong Kong, observing the ongoing protests, the ongoing interactions between Hong Kong politics and Taiwan politics. And that brings us to today's topic. There was a very interesting column published in Storm Media, which, by the way, recently launched a new app, although it's all in Mandarin, but it's a great new app with Storm Media's article. So please go view our content on the app. But there was a recent column published that is analyzing the statements by a policy advisor to Kuomintang Nationalist Party presidential candidate Kuo-yu, also the mayor of Kaohsiung. Policy advisor Suu Kyi, who previously worked in government under Lee Deng-hui of the Kuomintang and Ma Ying-jeou of the Kuomintang, and worked on China policy as well as at the National Security Council. Mr. Suu Kyi is also famous for coining the phrase 92 consensus, which is the understanding that Beijing and Taipei allegedly came to in the 1990s about how to describe the relationship between the two sides, which is there's one China each with their own interpretations. And this formed the basis of the China policies of the government of Ma Ying-jeou from 2008 to 2016. And as many of you will know, President Ing-Wen, when she took office in 2016, said we will not follow the 1992 consensus any longer, and that has led Beijing to take a long number of actions against Taiwan over the past 3+ years, constricting Taiwan's international space, persuading countries to de-recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan and to recognize the People's Republic of China in Beijing, and otherwise threatening Taiwan's security as well as economy. So what are the things that Suu Kyi, who is an expert on China-Taiwan relations and advisor to Kuo-yu, what are the 5 things that he says might rock? Yes, he actually used a phrase in Mandarin, Shandong Yao, which is basically saying rock, like an earthquake. What are the 5 things that he said might rock Taiwan-China relations in the near term? Well, the first thing he identified was the upcoming district council elections here in Hong Kong. Yes, on November 24th, there will be district council, local level governing bodies. They are concerned with local issues, not Hong Kong-wide policy issues, so the most basic local governance issues. These district council seats are directly elected. There are 18 districts across Hong Kong. This election will occur on November 24th. Historically, these elections have been won, broadly speaking, by pro-establishment political parties close to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, parties that are seen as close to the business establishment, and generally reflecting support for one country, two systems, and support for Beijing's policies towards Hong Kong. Yes, the Democrat camp, they have political parties and they have run candidates. They have won seats in these district council elections. But again, typically the majority of seats across Hong Kong's districts are won by pro-establishment parties. But in this upcoming election on November 24th, because of the ongoing events here in Hong Kong, the protests that began earlier this year over the government's now withdrawn extradition bill, which would have allowed the extradition of criminal suspects to various countries, including Taiwan and China, there is a hope by the Democrat camp here in Hong Kong that their candidates will win many seats, maybe even majority in some of the districts of these district council seats. And of course, that would be very uncomfortable, both for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government as well as for the central government in Beijing. So that was potential earthquake number 1. Number 2 would be the re-election of President Tsai. Well, as we know, the polls are showing that President Tsai has an increasingly large lead over the Kuomintang's Kuo-yu. Even though some polls in recent days indicate the lead, which maybe a week or 2 ago might have been 15 points, as some polls are now putting it as more in the range of 11 points. But with only about 70 days to go until the election on January 11th, 2020, it's looking increasingly likely that Tsai Ing-wen will win a second term. And of course, Beijing will be unhappy about that and will continue some of its policies that we mentioned earlier in the program. But that is potential earthquake number 2, re-election of President Tsai. Number 3 is, according to Suu Kyi, China-Taiwan policy expert, is if Beijing, the leadership in Beijing, determined that it's likely the Democratic Progressive Party won't just win this election in 2020, but they're going to win elections over the long term. So that wouldn't just be 2020. It could be local elections in 2022, the next national election for the president, as well as Taiwan's parliament, the legislative yuan, in 2024, and potentially going out beyond that. Well, it's hard to predict this. We know that a DPP president was elected in a split field in 2000. There were 3 candidates, 3 competitive candidates. 2004, the DPP candidate, or the incumbent president, Chen Shui-bian, was elected, but only by a very small margin. And in 2008 and 2012, a Kuomintang candidate was elected by large margin the first time, and then he was reelected, mind you, still by a comfortable amount, around 51% in his reelection in 2012. But then in 2016, the voters switched. They voted for the DPP, and Tsai Ing-wen was elected with about 56% of the vote, a very large margin of victory. She probably won't get that large margin of victory if she wins a second term in January. But it's clear that voters in Taiwan, at least historically during Taiwan's democracy era, have been willing to switch back and forth. But the issue that Mr. Su is probably trying to bring to the attention of commentators like us is that this time might be different. The voters of Taiwan are looking at China's policies. They're looking at recent events here in Hong Kong, and they might be making a decision that over the long term, they might not elect a Kuomintang presidential candidate anytime soon. And if it's not Tsai Ing-wen or the DPP that gets reelected in 2024, whoever their candidate is, Tsai Ing-wen will be term limited out. That it could be some other party that supports autonomy, a more localist kind of view on Taiwan's status that supports the formal separation of Taiwan from China. Again, that would all be to the exclusion of a Kuomintang candidate. So, yeah, that is a very interesting point as far as whether or not Beijing and the leadership in China is going to be making that assessment that over the long term, Taiwan's voters might continually elect non-Kuomintang presidents. The fourth item that Mr. Su identified that might rock ROC-PRC China-Taiwan relations is if China determines that the United States is going to take a very substantive role in Taiwan's election. We do know that the Trump administration is very supportive of a close US-Taiwan relationship. Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, so a bipartisan support is very strong in the U.S. Congress for Taiwan. We see lots of resolutions and legislation, even in recent days. Legislation was approved on the Senate side that eventually is very likely to be approved on the House side, supporting a stronger relationship between Taiwan and China. Is the United States actually taking action to influence voters here in Taiwan? No, the U.S. doesn't need to do that because the incumbent president, Tsai Ing-wen, she constantly reminds voters that under her tenure, during her 3+ years as president since May 2016, that the relationship between Taiwan and the United States has grown very strong. On the other hand, will the United States say something critical about Han Kuo-yu, something to indicate that the U.S. hopes the voters of Taiwan re-elect Tsai Ing-wen? We haven't seen anything like that yet. We do know that there's historical precedent for something like this because before the 2012 election, in the fall of 2011, Tsai Ing-wen visited Washington, D.C., and she was criticized by a National Security Council official in the media who said she didn't really seem prepared. Her policies weren't clear. That did have some impact. I mean, mind you, probably would have been reelected anyway, even if this American official in the Obama administration hadn't been so impolite to Taiwan, didn't even have the courtesy to identify him or herself when he made those comments anonymously to the media. But the key thing was it did get into the Taiwan media. This was a really prominent story that she went to Washington to impress the U.S. government with her credentials to be president of Taiwan. And the U.S. government criticized her in the media. So will we see that kind of criticism of Han Kuo-yu? Will there be the anonymous U.S. official who says something to the international media or to the Taiwan media to indicate the U.S. actually that blatantly has a preference? Again, hasn't happened yet. Probably won't happen. Taiwan is doing well on her own. Again, the poll showing that she has this large lead. Han Kuo-yu, as we talked about in a previous episode, decided not to visit Washington, D.C. Maybe he was afraid of this risk that there be a U.S. government official who would criticize him and say he's not prepared to be president. So there is that risk for the Kuomintang candidate, whether it's this election or the next election cycle. So I would say that's a very observant thing to identify that China might be looking at that. What is the U.S. appetite, the willingness of the United States to more directly support candidates in Taiwan's elections who don't have the same view as the Kuomintang as far as closer or more accommodationist policies when it comes to the relationship between Taiwan and China versus the political parties that have a much stronger view on protecting Taiwan's autonomy, or even going towards the direction of changing the name in the Constitution to something like the Republic of Taiwan instead of continuing to use Republic of China. The next issue that was identified is whether or not Xi Jinping faces internal domestic pressure in China as a result of challenges, or some would even say failures, of his policies towards Hong Kong and Taiwan. I would say this one remains to be seen. Obviously, the people in Hong Kong are unhappy with China's policies towards Hong Kong. We've seen that reflected by the ongoing protests. But the protests might sort of peter out over time. That's what happened in 2014 with the Occupy Central movement. So I would say that one we have to keep in view. We don't know yet whether or not the government's policies towards Hong Kong could be considered a failure as far as the long-term relationship. Of course, a lot of people will say one country, two systems is clearly a failure. It's not being implemented the way it was intended to. And that may be true, but it doesn't necessarily change the nature of the relationship between the central government in Beijing and the Hong Kong government, or policy decisions going forward. For example, there is no universal suffrage. It's not really something that Beijing is going to offer to the voters of Hong Kong anytime soon. So how Xi Jinping may face pressure from internal stakeholders over recent events in Hong Kong remains to be seen. Taiwan, well, clearly the voters have a preference in 2016. They might have the same preference in 2020 to re-elect Tsai Ing-wen. Does that mean Xi Jinping faces internal pressure that people will say, the other stakeholders, whether in the party or in the government or in the military, will say, your policies have been a failure. You have to do something more aggressive towards Taiwan. Again, keep in view, because if Tsai Ing-wen is re-elected, we'll probably see more of the same. We'll see more of the military exercises, persuading countries to de-recognize Taiwan and constricting Taiwan's international space. So it could very well be that the stakeholders in China say, Xi Jinping, we like what you're doing, so just keep doing it. Just because Tsai Ing-wen got reelected, it doesn't mean that Xi Jinping's policies might be seen by other stakeholders as a failure, at least not in the near term. Of course, the long-term goal, it's not a secret, China says this very frequently, is they do want to reunify or bring Taiwan into the fold of the People's Republic of China. So that one, maybe it's a bit weak as far as something that's actually going to happen, that Xi Jinping will face internal pressure. So what does it mean for all five of these? Well, some commentators in Taiwan say they're all going to happen, and that means Taiwan has no other choice but to submit. Of course, I don't agree with that view. I think Taiwan needs to continue to do what's necessary to improve its economic and political, military, national security, and these other factors, including Hong Kong. Taiwan leadership, politicians talking a lot about these ongoing events in Hong Kong. You could talk about it, but it still doesn't change what you need to do in Taiwan to improve Taiwan's economic and political and military security. Next week, I'll be back in Taiwan. Look forward to seeing you. I'm Ross Feingold. You've been watching Taiwan Hashtag on Storm Media.